I'm now honored to present our distinguished speaker on UN Day 75, and that would be Her Excellency Professor Judi Wahkungu. In January 2018, she was appointed the Ambassador of Kenya to the French Republic, Portugal, Serbia, and the Holy See. Professor Wahkungu served as Kenya's Cabinet Secretary for Environment and Natural Resources. She received her doctorate at the Pennsylvania State University and then served as an associate professor of science, technology, and society, and as the director of the Women in Science and Engineering, the WISE Institute. She had the distinction of being the designated energy expert for the United Nations Commission of Science and Technology for Development on the part of the Gender Working Group. Professor Wahkungu received her BS in geology from St. Lawrence University in New York, her MS degree in petroleum geology from Acadia University in Canada, and her PhD in resource management from Penn State University. She's the member of the Giants Club, which brings visionary leadership together to support the protection of elephants. She's a recipient of several honors and awards, including the Clark R. Bavin Wildlife Law Enforcement Award 2016. During her tenure, she enacted a number of substantive binding laws for the protection of environment in Kenya, such as the Climate Change Act of 2016 and Wildlife Conservation and Management Act of 2013. She captured global headlines when she championed the burning of Kenya's entire stockpile of ivory and rhino horns in 2016. Thank you. In 2017, she exemplified courage and visionary leadership when she boldly facilitated the enactment of a nationwide ban on the use of plastic polyethylene bags. She's a serial and very multi-talented achiever. In fact, she was a former international sportswoman, and she was Kenya's top-ranked tennis player as a youngster. She's got really a lot of talents. So without further ado, I'm honored to present Dr. Judi Wahkungu.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I am appreciative of the invitation to join you today to mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. The title of my presentation is The United Nations at 75, reflecting on our global commitment to multilateralism. Distinguished participants and friends, I will open with this observation. The ideals of the United Nations, and this is peace, justice, equality, and dignity, are beacons to a better world. But the organization that we celebrate today emerged only after tremendous suffering. These are the opening remarks of the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, while marking the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. The United Nations, as we know it today, has 193 members. The United Nations was launched formally on October 24th, 1945. It was ratified by 51 countries. Of these were 5 permanent members: China, France, the Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and the United States. The first UN General Assembly meeting, which included the other 46 signatories, convened in January 1946. The combined ideals and vision at that time were to maintain international peace and security, improve friendly relations among nations, and to be instrumental in developing continued, harmonized relations amongst countries. It is worth recalling, for the historians amongst you, that this initiative followed the League of Nations that was created in 1919 after World War I in compliance with the Treaty of Versailles. But when the Second World War broke out, the League of Nations basically died. Distinguished participants, the term United Nations is attributed to Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. They spearheaded an allied group of nations that were concerned about the casualties of 2 world wars, with millions of people dead and devastation everywhere. It was urgent that military confrontations amongst global powers be avoided. It was also extremely important to avoid a 3rd World War. The Secretary General Guterres stated that a 3rd World War, which so many had feared, has been avoided. Never in modern history have we gone so many years without military confrontation between the major powers. This is a great achievement of which all member states can be proud, and which we must all preserve. The founders of the United Nations resolved to commit to the elimination of nuclear weapons. The founders also paved the way for creating many other organizations for the greater good and prosperity of all members. The UN created the World Health Organization to eradicate communicable diseases. It created the High Commissioner for Refugees to manage the plight of the displaced and disenfranchised victims of war. It created the United Nations Environment Programme. It created the United Nations Women. It created UNESCO. It created the United Nations Criminal Court, and many other institutions of which all of you are familiar. Secretary General Guterres went further to cite other historic accomplishments of the United Nations. This included the UN's role in peace, treaties, and peacekeeping, the leadership of the UN in decolonization, human rights standards, and the mechanisms to uphold them. He also mentioned the triumph over apartheid, the life-saving humanitarian aid for millions of victims of conflict and disaster. He mentioned the eradication of diseases, the steady reduction of hunger, the progressive development of international law, and landmark agreements to protect the environment. Concerning the latter, he singled out the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement for Climate Change. Distinguished participants, allow me to beg your indulgence to use the issue of climate change to consider another perspective on the UN 75th meeting of the General Assembly. And this is that of His Holiness, Pope Francis. The Holy Father took this opportunity to reflect on his address of the 70th meeting of the General Assembly, touching on the issues of Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on climate change. He remembered the exuberation and hope at that time, but noted sadly, 5 years later, and although there was some progress, the international community has shown itself as largely incapable of honoring the promises of 5 years ago. The Holy Father wondered whether the United Nations was perhaps falling into a declarationist nominalism, and urged the UN to ensure that institutions were effective in delivering on their promised mandates. Concerning declarationist nominalism, Secretary General Guterres stated that 25 years since the Beijing Platform of Action, gender inequality remains the greatest single challenge to human rights around the world. This is so far removed from the aspirations of all those who assembled with purpose and vision in Beijing 25 years ago. As you all know, women still face many obstacles in accessing equal opportunities in most spheres of life. Violence and other forms of harmful practices remain a reality for many women. Women are more at risk of being disenfranchised than men. This is a fact. Compared to men, women are less represented in the labor force, and they also hold the less desirable jobs. Moreover, women devote more time than men on unpaid care and domestic work. Advances in legal reforms are helping women and men reconcile work and family life. But we still have a very long way to go to achieve gender parity. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these disparities, further threatening the strides that have been achieved. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in a global health crisis. The socio-economic impacts are so severe that we are still on high alert to understand the magnitude. Sadly, at this critical juncture, support for global cooperation is being tested. There are many questions to probe. For example, how are we going to regroup and to recover in the spirit of multilateralism? This pandemic reminds us that we are one community living in the only home we have. Our home is planet Earth, where all perceived boundaries are socially constructed and therefore arbitrary. In fact, for those who ever doubted, we are now acutely aware that we are all interconnected. One isolated action anywhere in the world that crosses biodiversity conservation tenets can and does affect all of us. We are one. Distinguished participants and friends, probing further and perhaps more deeply, are we going to come out of this pandemic with the fortitude of cooperation and a willingness of supporting one another? Or are we going to delve further into isolation under the cloud of distrust and blaming? How we respond will determine our future, and to use the United Nations verbiage, it will determine the future we want. The future we want for the next decade, according to the 75th anniversary of the UN General Assembly resolution, includes promoting peace, protecting the earth and environment, gender equality, women empowerment, sustainable financing, and also digital cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to be very direct. The United Nations is commemorating its 75th anniversary when the world is in turmoil. Geopolitical differences are escalating. Hatred is widespread. Our ability to manage refugees and internally displaced people is being challenged, even as we speak. We are also threatened by nuclear weapons. And let us remember that this is an institution that was conceived to end war. Our human rights and gender equality are being questioned. And this is 25 years after the Beijing platform. Extreme poverty and the plight of the disenfranchised is also rising. While new technologies have presented new opportunities, they have also exposed unforeseen threats. All these challenges require and must be addressed from a multilateral platform. But sadly, we are facing this when there is a dearth of multilateral solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, these multilateral solutions must respond to a myriad of perspectives. For example, the African Union reiterated at the 75th anniversary that the UN Security Council must be reformed in order to be more inclusive, more fair, and more democratic. On the other hand, the European Union declared its support for the UN by stating that the European Union shall continue working hand in hand with the UN for purposes of peace, dialogue, and cooperation. The European Union reiterated its support for promoting human rights, the rule of law, sustainable development, and fighting climate change. The small island developing states, on the other hand, made it clear that the climate crisis that we face today is a manifestation of unsustainable development without consideration and consequences of the environment, without consideration of people, and is therefore the greatest threat to future generations. These are all truths that we must value and respect. Indeed, the United Nations has always upheld the virtue of national sovereignty, as the desire for a world government, as you know, is just not tangible. But we all live on planet Earth, and we are all interconnected. The United Nations must therefore continue to foster cooperation based on common values, based on common and shared responsibilities. Distinguished participants, shared responsibilities can be best exemplified by referring to the issue of climate change and the environment in general. As you all know, we are in the throes of a climate crisis. This year, we have recorded the highest temperatures ever. Glaciers in the Arctic are melting at unprecedented levels. Plastic pollution has been identified in the Antarctic. Erratic weather events, ranging from extreme flooding to severe droughts, have now become the new normal. Wildfires are being experienced from the west coast of the United States to Australia. This is also the worst hurricane season ever recorded in the Atlantic. Further, our biodiversity has collapsed. The carnage is everywhere. I need not remind you that 1 million species are in danger of extinction, even as we speak. When we destroy biodiversity, we destroy and decimate the protection systems that support human life. I fear that if we don't act decisively now, we may run out of time to save planet Earth and to make it habitable for future generations. Distinguished participants, as I conclude, the multilateral challenges we face are enormous. We must counter these challenges with multilateral solutions, even when some powerful countries are pursuing unilateralism. And you know the powerful countries I'm talking about, those that are pursuing unilateralism. It is crucial that international financial institutions, trading blocs, and regional bodies to reinvigorate their collegiality. We must reinvigorate our collegiality. And let us not forget that multilateralism must also include voices from the youth and also voices from the civil society. Ladies and gentlemen, 70 years ago today, in fact, it's precisely 75 years ago today, the world came together under the umbrella of the United Nations. Countries did so in the spirit of mutually beneficial cooperation for a peaceful world, for a more equitable world, and for a world that respects human rights and a healthier planet. While there has been some progress, this progress has been clearly uneven. The UN Secretary-General Guterres concluded the 75th anniversary by stating that we are facing our 1945 moment. We must meet that moment. We must show unity like never before to overcome today's emergencies. We must get the world moving, working, and prospering together again. Distinguished participants, let us together continue making our contribution to a more equitable world. Multilateralism can no longer be taken for granted. I thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Wahkungu, not only for joining us today, for your wonderful comments on UN Day 75, but also for your years of service in protecting our environment and being a champion for women's role in both government and in science and technology. You've truly been a champion in those realms, and we thank you once again.